In a modest hall in Ouagadougou, the air is thick with heat and tension. President Ibrahim Traoré stands before a crowd of students, mothers and elders, his uniform worn, his voice unwavering. "My message today is not an attack on the West," he begins. "It is a call to protect the women of Africa." Then he says the words that silence the room. "African women, stop marrying European men. They did not come here for love." It is not hate speech, it is pain turned into politics. For Burkina Faso and millions following African news, that moment marks a turning point, a young leader daring to name the wound everyone else ignores. Why would a president speak so boldly? What truth lies behind those words, love, power, or the ghost of colonial pride? Hit like and stay with us as we uncover the meaning behind this warning. When Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, spoke those words, they spread across the continent like a wildfire. Within a few hours, global media from BBC to Africa News replayed his speech over and over, labeling it as controversial, divisive, or anti-West. But for millions of Africans, it was something far deeper, a cry of pain, an act of truth, telling in a world still haunted by inequality. Traoré was not warning against love. He was warning against illusion, the illusion that salvation lies across the sea. Every year, thousands of young women leave African villages chasing the promise of a Western dream. They marry men from France, Sweden, or Germany, believing they have found freedom. But many return home scarred emotionally, physically, and spiritually. In his speech, Traoré spoke with the fire of truth. "They do not see you as human. They see you as symbols of conquest." Those words silenced the crowd because they carried history, centuries of colonization, exploitation, and the endless struggle for respect. In Burkina Faso, a nation still fighting for true economic independence, the message struck deep. For Traoré, these marriages were not acts of love, but mirrors of mental slavery. He called it voluntary bondage, when Africans trade dignity for validation, believing that European acceptance means progress. Immediately, international observers condemned him. Western diplomats called the speech dangerous populism. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, people nodded, mothers wept, students applauded. They understood this was not an attack, it was protection. He said what every African leader has been too afraid to say. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was not a story about borders or race. It was a story about agency, about daring to declare, Africa does not need to be rescued. But that speech, powerful, direct, unapologetic, was only the beginning. Because what came next would ignite a fire across continents. Among the thousands who heard Ibrahim Traoré's warning, there were those who had lived the very pain he described. One of them was Samra, a young woman from Ethiopia. She met a Swedish engineer through a charity program and believed his promise of a new life. But when she moved to Europe, that promise became a prison. At first, she smiled through the isolation, but the bruises came later hidden beneath long sleeves, ignored by neighbors. When she finally fled with her child, she discovered that the law was not on her side. The court ruled that the father could still visit his son. Samra had no papers, no family, no home. With a trembling voice, she told Africa News. They called it justice, but justice felt white. Her words echoed across radio stations throughout Africa. For many, her story proved that what Ibrahim Traoré said was not exaggeration, it was truth. He had given voice to the pain that so many African women had endured in silence. In Burkina Faso, murals appeared overnight, women standing tall beneath the slogan, "Not for sale, not for conquest." University students painted Traoré's face beside Thomas Sankara's 2 generations apart, yet one message unchanged. International outlets continued to label him radical, but every time they repeated his name, his influence grew wider. He became a paradox of history, condemned by diplomats, loved by the poor. "He spoke with fire," said an elderly woman in Ouagadougou, her voice breaking. And for the first time, someone listened. By the end of that month, his speech had transformed from scandal to movement. It was no longer a sentence, it was a soul. Because when the women of Africa looked into Samra's eyes, they no longer saw pity, they saw themselves. And that was the moment the world realized. Traoré's words were not dividing Africa from the West. They were reuniting Africans with each other. But beyond the emotion lay an even deeper question. What does this mean for the continent's future? In the weeks following the speech, its echoes could be felt across Africa. From small villages to crowded capitals, families began to speak of things long buried: migration, humiliation, and the quiet despair of those who had left. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré turned words into action. He ordered a review of government programs supporting African women abroad, demanding accountability from Western embassies accused of abandoning African citizens in times of crisis. His administration began drafting initiatives to help single mothers return home to rebuild, to educate, to heal. In a follow-up address broadcast on Africa News, he declared, "Every tear of an African woman abroad is a wound on Africa's skin." The phrase struck deep. It appeared on posters, songs, church sermons, and graffiti walls. In Ouagadougou, women gathered at night, sharing stories of loss, defiance, and rebirth. It was as if the continent had suddenly remembered its forgotten daughters. But this social awakening came with a heavy political price. Western governments quietly froze development grants to Burkina Faso, citing human rights concerns. NGOs that once praised Traoré for transparency now accused him of moral nationalism. Still, the crowds of the Sahel did not waver. They saw the backlash not as punishment, but as proof. Because if a single speech could provoke such global discomfort, perhaps it was because it revealed an uncomfortable truth. Africa had stopped apologizing. Local media called it a moral revolution. What began as a warning about love had become a demand for sovereignty, the right to define what dignity means on African soil. Traoré's approval rating soared. He became more than the president of Burkina Faso. He became the symbol of a movement, asking one simple, powerful question: if we can protect our land, why not protect our hearts? And that question would soon challenge not only culture, but the very foundations of global diplomacy itself. Soon, the ripple effects of Ibrahim Traoré's speech reached the halls of global power. In Brussels and Paris, diplomats framed his warning as misogynistic nationalism, twisting its intent into a political weapon. European television ran headlines like, "Burkina Faso's president sparks gender controversy." Yet very few outlets quoted the rest of his message, the part about dignity, exploitation, and forgotten women. Africa News defended him, releasing an editorial titled, "Beyond the Outrage, Understanding Traoré's Warning." They argued that the president's words were not about controlling women but protecting them from a system that romanticizes inequality. In Burkina Faso, the piece went viral, restoring context to a narrative the West had already tried to rewrite. But the diplomatic costs were real. Development loans were delayed, aid programs suspended, and several European ambassadors left Ouagadougou in protest. In response, Traoré addressed his people again, saying calmly, "When you speak truth to power, power will pretend to be offended." In Washington, opinion was divided. Some US commentators labeled him the African populist of the decade. Others, particularly within the African American community, saw him differently, as a voice of self-respect, echoing the words of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. In churches of Atlanta and Harlem, his quote appeared in sermons. "We do not ask for equality. We live as though we already are." By autumn, student unions across Africa had adopted his phrase, "back to dignity," and for the first time, Western think tanks began to take Burkina Faso seriously, not as an aid-dependent state, but as a moral leader in Africa's search for self-definition. Still, for all the admiration, a shadow loomed. As one Africa News analyst wrote, "Every revolution of pride risks becoming a revolution of isolation." The world was watching. Would Ibrahim Traoré's defiance unite the continent, or leave Burkina Faso standing alone? That uncertainty set the stage for what came next, a turning point that would redefine the balance of power across Africa. In the United States, the message of Ibrahim Traoré landed differently. It wasn't the controversy that caught attention, it was the courage. Major networks replayed his words under headlines like, "African President Challenges Western Morality." But in the corners of America that understood history's long shadow, there was no laughter, no outrage, only recognition. At Howard University, a panel of African studies professors gathered to discuss the deeper meaning of Traoré's declaration. They noted that Burkina Faso, a nation once dismissed as small and poor, had become a moral compass for the continent. Dr. Kareem Johnson, an African-American historian, said on Africa News Live, "Traoré speaks the language of sovereignty, not of hate. He's reminding the world that liberation is not complete until self-worth is restored." On social media, the hashtag number #TraoréTruth began trending across the diaspora. From New York to Lagos, people debated what his words meant in their own context. Black activists in the US saw parallels between his call for dignity and the civil rights movement, between Africa's struggle for respect and their own. In Los Angeles, a church pastor opened his Sunday sermon with a quote from Traoré: "We cannot be free if we still measure our worth by someone else's eyes." The congregation nodded, many of them first-generation immigrants, who knew what it meant to straddle two worlds. Even mainstream journalists, once skeptical, began to shift their tone. One Washington Post editorial admitted that perhaps Traoré's words should not be dismissed as provocation, but studied as a philosophy of identity reclamation. For Americans who still viewed Africa through the lens of aid and crisis, this was new. Here was a leader from Burkina Faso, a country rarely mentioned in US politics, now shaping moral conversation on the global stage. And as discussions deepened, one question began to echo across American think tanks. Is Ibrahim Traoré the beginning of a new African century, or the end of Western dominance? The answer would depend on how the world chose to listen next. As weeks turned into months, Ibrahim Traoré's words continued to ripple across the world. In Latin America, journalists drew parallels between Africa's voluntary bondage and their own histories of dependency. In South Asia, student group quoted Traoré in debates about post-colonial identity. Even in parts of Europe, the very continent he had criticized, intellectuals began to concede that perhaps his challenge was not to Europe's existence, but to its conscience. The BBC aired a special segment titled Burkina Faso's Voice of Defiance. It showed footage of Traoré walking through the streets of Ouagadougou without security guards, shaking hands with vendors, speaking to children. He was no longer just the leader of a small Sahel nation. He had become the embodiment of a question that transcended borders. What does freedom mean when the chains are invisible? In France, a historian wrote in Le Monde, "Africa no longer asks permission to speak, and that may be what frightens us most." Meanwhile, Africa News reported a surge in public support across the continent. From Senegal to Tanzania, murals of Traoré appeared with the caption, "The Spirit of the Sahel." His speeches were shared in classrooms, mosques, and community centers, inspiring a new generation to rethink what modern independence truly meant. For many Western analysts, this shift was unsettling. If Africa began defining its own morality, its own path, then the centuries-old hierarchy of who teaches and who listens would collapse. And that, perhaps, was the unspoken revolution. In Washington and London, policy experts began to ask whether Burkina Faso, once seen as geopolitically irrelevant, could now become the nucleus of a new intellectual awakening. One UN diplomat put it succinctly, "Traoré is no longer a man. He is a symbol, and symbols cannot be sanctioned." But as his influence grew, a twist was coming, one that would test whether this newfound pride could withstand the world's pressure. Then came the unexpected twist. Amidst the noise, the criticism, and the diplomatic chill, Ibrahim Traoré announced a new national program, Women of Africa Rising, broadcast live on Africa News. The initiative pledged to provide education, financial support, and leadership training to women across Burkina Faso, particularly those returning from abroad after failed marriages or abuse. Traoré declared, "We will no longer measure progress by how many of our daughters marry Europeans. We will measure it by how many stand on their own." It was not merely a policy, it was a philosophy turned tangible. For the first time, an African leader had translated emotional truth into structural change. Local journalists described the atmosphere in Ouagadougou that day as electric. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, waving flags, chanting, "Dignity is our dowry." Western outlets hesitated. How do you criticize a man who empowers women while defying the West? They tried, but their headlines sounded hollow. Within weeks, Burkina Faso saw record participation from young women signing up for training and education. The government promised to expand the model regionally, inviting partners from Mali, Niger, and Ghana. Traoré's message had shifted from confrontation to construction. He was no longer just the man who told Africa to stop begging. He had begun building the tools for Africa to stand tall. But the second twist was still to come, one that would lift him beyond politics, into legend. The second twist did not come from a policy or a speech. It came from the people. Within months of the Women of Africa Rising initiative, a spontaneous movement began across the continent. It was called Back to Dignity. No one ordered it. No government sponsored it. It was born in songs, murals, podcasts, and whispered prayers from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Africa News called it a cultural resurrection, while European outlets struggled to describe it without sounding condescending. For millions, Ibrahim Traoré had ceased to be just a president. He had become a mirror of what Africans wanted to believe about themselves: unbroken, unashamed, unstoppable. His most famous words echoed again. "We don't ask permission to be free, we stand up and claim it." That line appeared on classroom walls, protest banners, and even wedding invitations. In Burkina Faso, school children began reciting his quotes alongside national anthems. In Nairobi, poets wrote verses titled "The Son of the Sahel." What began as a controversial warning had become a declaration of rebirth. The world could sanction his economy, isolate his country, or silence his voice, but they could not unmake the idea he had unleashed. For in every nation, in every language, the message endured. Freedom begins when love no longer means submission. And from that moment, Ibrahim Traoré was no longer a man of Burkina Faso, he was the conscience of Africa itself. As the sun sinks over Ouagadougou, the horizon burns gold and crimson, the colors of struggle and hope intertwined. The sound of drums from the Sahel rolls through the streets, not as noise, but as memory, the heartbeat of a people who have refused to kneel. In that fading light stands Ibrahim Traoré, not merely a soldier, not merely a leader, but a man who carries the weight of generations that were told to wait for freedom. He does not wait, he rises. That evening, in his final address of the year broadcast across Africa News, across static-filled radios and flickering TV screens, he spoke with a voice calm as dusk, yet fierce as truth itself. "We do not ask for permission to be free. We stand up and claim it." Those words were not just heard, they traveled. They crossed deserts and rivers, passed through villages where children still learn by candlelight, echoed in church halls, mosques and marketplaces, and settled in the hearts of millions who had long forgotten that dignity is not given, it is reclaimed. In the refugee camps of Chad, young men repeated his words over firelight. In the classrooms of Accra and Dakar, teachers whispered them like prayer. In the streets of Bamako and Lomé, women hummed them between the rhythm of trade and survival. And somewhere between the noise of politics and the silence of faith, a new story of Africa began to write itself. A story not dictated by Washington or Paris, but born in the dust and heartbeat of her own soil. A story where freedom is no longer imported, but reborn. Traoré once said, "African women are the heartbeat of this continent. If the heart is sold, Africa dies." Those words too became prophecy. For it was the women, the farmers, the teachers, the mothers who refused despair, who kept that heart beating when everything else was broken. They carried water and wisdom. They rebuilt schools. They reminded men who had lost hope that courage is not a weapon, it is a duty. Now, across Burkina Faso, that heart beats again. It beats through the hands of blacksmiths in Ouagadougou, through the songs of students in Bobo Dioulasso, through the silent prayers of soldiers guarding dusty roads under the Sahel moon. It beats for a generation rising without fear, a generation that no longer bows its head to colonial memory or global pity, a generation that dares to dream in its own language and build in its own name. And as the drums echo into the night, the world begins to listen not to Africa's pain, but to her power. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, let his message live through you. Share his words, tell his story, and remember, the freedom of one African nation ignites the hope of all. God bless Burkina Faso. God bless the new Africa, proud, unbroken, and awake.